in this case, the dry cow diet is much more important than what you're doing in lactation.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. My name is Reagan Bluell, and I'm from the University of Missouri Dairy team, and I'm excited to announce today that we have a guest from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Hernandez is here to talk about her paper looking at feeding different energy levels at the end of lactation and how that impacts the body condition score through the dry period and then the subsequent lactation. We know that those high-producing dairy cows need to hit the ground running in early lactation in order to hit that peak milk by 2 months. And there's been so much science committed to understanding that the first 3 weeks of lactation are directly manipulated by the dry period. Questions we have here in this particular paper is, what about the late lactation phase? Is there something that we can do differently? Can we manage those cows differently to ensure more success in the subsequent lactation? So all of these results were featured in a recent article in Press of the Journal of Dairy Science titled "The Effects of High Energy and Low Energy Diets During Late Lactation on the Subsequent Dry Period and Lactation of Holstein Dairy Cows." So let's sit back and listen to best understand how to feed your herd through this window of time. Dr. Hernandez, welcome to the Dairy Science Digest. Could you please take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences. My primary area is lactation physiology, specific dry cow and early lactation. I've been really interested in hypocalcemia and as well as other dry cow disorders that lead to negative health outcomes. And this project is a result of many discussions with my colleague Milo Wiltbank, who is one of the other authors on the paper. And he and I at one point just started merging things together and asking lots of
Yes.
questions. And that is how this project came to be. So,
Well, that's fantastic. I love to hear that. And I know listeners, if they've listened at any length throughout the seasons, they know that I'm a geek about the transition cow, right? And so just for clarity, guys, that transition window is about 3 weeks prior to calving and 3 weeks after calving, defined way back in the 90s. But this went a little bit deeper, right?
mhm.
You were looking at after that animal had been determined pregnant. And could you talk a little bit about the structure of your research project?
Sure. So one day, Milo and I are on the same floor, and we had a lot of questions about data coming out related to more associative information about negative body condition score effects, or in my case, hypocalcemic effects on reproduction and various kind of immune outcomes in the transition cow. And most of this was like,
Hmm.
you feed something and you have a fat cow. And most of the projects have been done where they're feeding lots of energy during the dry period
Hmm.
and how that affects reproductive outcomes. And he and I, as physiologists, were like, but we want to know the mechanism.
What's
What
happening?
is the mechanism? What's
Yeah,
happening?
this big
And
black box.
yeah, do these associations really ring true when you try to design an experiment to check this out? So this project, he's been doing a lot of work on this high fertility cycle,
Hmm.
along with my colleague Paul Fricke. And Milo has had this hypothesis that a cow with a higher body condition score, and he's somewhere in that range, high being above 275 to 3.0 at dry off, and how this impacts these outcomes for reproduction. So
Hmm.
when we were thinking about how to look at this, all of the literature we'd seen was they feed high energy diets during the dry period, and no
Hmm.
one really does that. No one's going to feed that Goldilocks
Right,
diet during the dry period because we know it causes problems.
right.
So when we talked with our colleague Randy Shaver, the nutritionist in the group, we were like, how can we approach this differently to figure out what's happening? Because we know not to feed high energy diets during that dry period. So when we sat down to design this experiment, we thought about how once you reach peak lactation, you're going to start to deposit more energy after that because the cow's
Yeah,
not producing as much milk.
over the
But
hump.
she is also pregnant
Yeah.
and that diminishes. And so there's an opportunity there to look at what might happen if the cow got to a higher body condition score during that period of time and what that would look like postpartum. That was kind of the etiology of this project, and no one had
Hmm.
ever looked at it this way.
What kind of ration did Schaefer design to kind of shake out these effects?
So when we sat down on how to go at this, Randy had suggested to maybe use Megalac in order to
Hmm.
increase the energy level of the diet to get them to that higher body condition score. And our thought was to try to get to 4. We never got there. It was not achievable because we got to a point where we were concerned that the cows would get ruminal acidosis. So
Wow.
in the end, what we ended up at was, like it says in the study, we had a group of cows that were 3.25 and a group of cows that were 3.75. And that was how they broke out by body condition score. And we were checking this. It was one consistent student, Tiago Cunha, my former PhD student who
Committed
works for
graduate
Parnell now.
students.
Yeah,
Yes,
we have a
good.
great team on the eighth
Good.
floor.
I love it.
Um,
I love it.
but he was doing all the BCS. So it was consistent. The same person was doing it. And as it says in there, we were also doing ultrasound of the back fat.
Okay, and so these 66 cows were confirmed
Hmm.
pregnant and then
Yes.
stratified by body condition score by this single individual that was dedicated throughout the entire project, and they
Yes.
were moved into tie stalls. Why did you put them into tie stalls?
You want to get dry matter intake.
Sure.
And that is hard to achieve. And because we were looking at them at an individual level, so we used the Tystall facility at the Dairy Forage Research Center.
Sure, and that allowed you to capture the differences between the high energy and the
Yes.
low energy.
Yes.
And the data here in the paper reported
Hmm.
that high was considered, we're looking at net energy of lactation, guys, right? Your mega cows
Yes.
per pound if you're looking at your ration, but it's reported in kilograms here in the paper. So the high would be considered 1.74 and the low being 1.5. And if I did
Hmm.
my math right, if you're looking at your ration sheet from your nutritionist, high energy and late lactation, they quantified that at 0.79 or low energy at 0.68. So just to kind of get you guys
Hmm.
to pull out your ration, look at what your nutritionist is doing in your herd, and compare and contrast to what the results were found here in this particular herd. Let's talk about how did you create the high energy versus the low energy? What were the different dietary ingredients fed during the late lactation ration?
So primarily the big difference was the amount of Megalac
Hmm.
in the ration. And that was kind of the easiest way to get more energy into those cows. And then the other thing that we did in order to get the low energy changes in that compared to the high energy was we had more alfalfa haylage and more wheat straw than the high energy cows. Um, and because we were using that calcium salt of fatty acids to put more
Sure.
energy in there. So that was kind of the difference between those treatment groups for the most part.
Just just bulked it up, right?
Yes.
With that
Yep.
wheat straw and reduce the high moisture corn. Okay, and so did they eat it?
They did.
Yeah.
They sure did. There were a few things, and it's not fully in here because, as you saw, this was a really large study and a very
Hmm.
long study. And one of the things that happened was the cows adjusted their milk production. So, in order to compensate for what they were eating, there were certain cows that never became fat. And that was because they just started making more milk, which is a challenge
Yes.
in a late lactation
Isn't
cow.
that funny? Isn't that
Yep.
funny?
And certain
Yes. Yeah.
cows in the low energy group just stopped making milk.
She's like, I'm done.
Yeah,
And guys, that's why it's so important to have this individual animal monitoring so that we can really understand the unique differences between each one of these beasts, right? And
right.
guy, you can't see her eyes on the video right now, but this physiologist, the textbook says they're supposed to do this, right?
Yep.
So why did some of these cows not read the textbook?
Right.
Yeah.
So we're doing we have a couple of like side papers because it was incredible and we thought it was important to talk
Hmm.
about those nuances
Hmm.
for future study designs and get
Yeah.
at what the physiology is on that because they didn't read the textbook.
Yes.
And so we're excited to get that
Can't wait to read
out
that.
there
Yeah.
because it
Neat.
was it was incredible to watch them do that.
Sure.
So that was how we achieved those. And they
Okay.
ate the diets, and we fed these diets for 12 weeks. And
Yep.
they started in the group that were getting the high energy, started to increase their body condition score as well as their back fat thickness.
Mm-hmm.
Ones with the more controlled energy, they didn't really change much. They went up a little bit. And so in the end, while we were trying to achieve a bigger gap between the two, but because of the limitation of not wanting to give them Sarah, um,
Mm-hmm.
we certainly went to this. They had to be within half standard deviation to be in the group. So as I said, in a future publication, we'll talk about what we call responders versus non-responders.
Mm.
But
Yes, I've got a question
yes.
about that later on. Yes, good. Okay, so
So,
graphically, I think this is a great opportunity to draw attention to the fact that at the bottom of the show notes, guys, there's a clickable link that takes you directly to the Journal of Dairy Science open access paper. And you'll flip near the middle of the paper, figure one, letter A, talks about that it graphically, what she just said,
yes.
the body condition score on the y-axis and the 3 months that they fed the different diet. And you can
Yes.
quickly see the segregation of the two lines where those low energy animals, of course, they were gaining a little bit of condition because they're in later lactation, milk
Mhm.
yield's starting to go down. So they're starting to lay on some fat. But boy, those high energy animals that are receiving that much higher plane of energy definitely started to pack on some of that fat, and all of that was planned. That was exactly what you were supposed to do. And so what I found really interesting was looking at the dynamics of dry matter intake in addition to that. So when I overlay graph A
Hmm.
to graph E and kind of look at, yes, they were eating more, but what I found interesting is over time that that cow that was later in gestation receiving the lower energy, had some wheat straw in the ration, their dry matter intake just started to kind of taper off.
Yes.
As low as, they were down to 20, 21
Hmm.
kilograms. So that'd be like 40 pounds of dry matter intake. So much less than a typical Holstein would do
Hmm.
in later lactation. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think's going on there in that low energy late lactation animal?
Their milk production was certainly going down. As I said, there were some I'll never forget because at Dairy Forage they milk 3 times a day.
Hmm.
We had this was I think one of the outlier non-responder types, but one cow that was milking 2 pounds.
Oh man,
And they were like, "Do we
bless her
really have to
heart.
keep milking this cow?" And I was like, "Yes, we need to."
Yes, yeah, we have to
I'm
quantify it.
sorry. I'm sorry. So there was certainly a milk production response, and they just seem to adjust physiologically.
Hmm.
We believe there's some hormonal responses going on there that we'd like to investigate in the future. And as I said, will be part of a future publication where the cow was like, I'm done. I'm not getting much. And so
Can we
like we
talk a
can
little
shut
bit
this
about
down.
that? There,
Sure.
there in your discussion, you were talking about leptin and that
Hmm.
oxidative, hepatic oxidative theory. Can we dive right into that deep dark box of energy partitioning, Miss
Sure.
Physiologist, please? Yes.
Sure. So I'm not as into the hepatic oxidative theory, but as a lactation biologist, energy partitioning, that's where my life is.
Isn't that cool?
So, these cows that are in these dominant processes like lactation or pregnancies, and they're not in like an average day-to-day, I'm not pregnant, I'm not lactating, this is the minimal amount of things I need to survive, right?
Hmm.
They have to be able to put their nutrients into several different places, and they're going to adjust this through things like leptin and
Hmm.
adiponectin and insulin and glucagon. Because if they're getting less energy, then why would you work as hard to put as much milk out? Because your energy level is lower.
Right.
And you see this not just in cows, you see it in other mammalian species
Mammals.
that are
Hmm.
lactating. If they don't eat enough, you're going to have to make an adjustment in order to survive. And
Right.
so I suspect that that's what's going on with these animals, why we need individual data.
Hmm.
because every animal is different. Some animals can
Yeah.
keep going and it's no problem. And whether that's all hormonal or if there's genetics,
Hmm.
that remains to be seen yet. But some animals are able to adjust in a way that others aren't. And it's why having studies as much as we can that are long term, like ours, and combining that with large numbers of animals are so critical in the transfer of what we do to the farmers and the nutritionists out there and the consultants because, there's so much variability in the animal as well
Hmm.
as the environment. So,
If I could frame this for the listeners just a little bit so that they have a level of appreciation, you were
sure.
talking about the extensive nature of this research project. These 66 head, not only were they hand delivering a diet that was actually measured every single day on a scale, there was also blood samples that were being taken throughout the entire study, looking at,
Yes.
the body, not only the body condition score, but we want to correlate that back to some of the metabolic parameters. So
Hmm.
in previous podcasts, you've heard me talk about NEFAs or non-esterified fatty acids and beta hydroxybutyrates. And so all of these are good measurements that we can help us understand what is actually happening inside that animal. And I'd be curious, I know it's not documented here in the paper, but do you happen to have the genetic analysis on this 66 head? I'd be curious if there was a way to backtrack and configure to see if there was a genetic effect or a sire effect
Uh-huh.
associated with their response or non-response.
Great question. All of our animals are genotyped in our herd, so I'm sure we could do that. And it's one thing that actually my graduate student brought up, and I likely believe it is a component that looking at some of these genetic possibilities are important and might be worth looking at least preliminarily.
Hmm.
Every geneticist I know in my department would tell me 66 cows is not enough.
Hmm. Right, for a
And
genetic. Hmm.
and particularly with the small number of animals that did or didn't respond, it would be hard to extrapolate, but it might be like a first step. A colleague of mine, Francisco Peña Garicano in my department, he did some work on the calcemic side where he got some data from herds in Florida. He took data from projects of mine that I had over the years where I had calcium and whether or not they got hypocalcemia or not. So he was able to pull many studies together to try to
Hmm.
get at that. And I think that's something worth maybe putting together from our perspective as well. And I do have a few colleagues in my department, specifically like Heather White. She has lots of data on
Hmm.
BHBs and ketosis that I know, and she does work with Francisco on the feed efficiency side, but kind of getting at some of these questions might be worthwhile. But we were the first to approach this manipulation of energy in this
Hmm.
manner.
Right.
And that's what makes, I think, our study unique because all of the high fat, low fat diets, at least from what I could tell in the literature, were largely done during the dry period.
Hmm.
And interestingly, in fact, what we saw was that the cows were fine postpartum if they went on a normal dry cow diet.
Yeah, let's
So,
so let's
yeah.
talk a little bit about this. Okay, so we've mapped out that we're doing high or low energy in the last 3 months of lactation, and then you're targeting about a 45 day, 47-day dry
Hmm.
period. Then they freshen and you followed them for a little bit longer. But before we get there,
Hmm.
talk about that dry cow ration. Was it any different?
They were all given the same ration. At Dairy Forage, they typically feed, it's their standard herd diet. They feed a low energy potassium maintenance diet. They don't typically use like a decad, but it's just a low energy, put in some bulk so that you're not adding a lot of fat to the cows, kind of your Midwestern diet, so to speak.
Hmm.
And so they all received that, and then they all went on a common lactating diet after they gave birth. So
Very good. So the
after,
only
yeah,
treatment was that last 3 months of
yeah.
lactation. Well, I know that I've got a listener out there. I'm going to try to clear the air here that's thinking if they got this high level of energy late in lactation, aka late in gestation, did you have any dystocia? Any calf differences?
Good question. We really saw nothing. There were no, and we
Hmm.
didn't have enough numbers to do like real statistical analysis, but we didn't have
They were
an
close. Yeah.
anything. And
No.
what you would what I would say, like it's one of those times when a grad student walks into your office and they're like, Laura, nothing happened
Yeah.
postpartum.
And you're like, great.
Can we
Yes.
can we like publish this? Like nothing happened. And I said, that's amazing because that tells
Yes.
you, at
That's
least in this
information.
study, that's information, and that in this case, the dry cow diet is much more important than what you're doing in lactation.
That's right.
We need to understand more about how those cows were adapting and why. But why
Hmm.
is it that like you can modify the diet when they're in the dry period and you don't
Hmm.
have these postpartum disorders? And that is a
Really
huge
interesting.
question and really
Uh-huh.
interesting and I think important to the industry.
Very good. Yes. Okay. So all the ration was the same. The calves were not different. We're still extensively studying the difference in subcutaneous fat that's quantified both visually with body condition score, but
Hmm.
also scanning the back fat. And then they went into lactation. Let's really zoom into those first 3 weeks of lactation. What were some interesting take-home points with early lactation?
Sure. So, what we saw, at least during early lactation, was that we had no difference in BHBAs, none in NEFA. So, we didn't have any like extra mobilization of fat tissue that was causing this compensation. And what we think was happening, we have rumination data, but when we were in the dry cow situation at that farm, what they do is they go to like the facility set up that they go to this far off barn initially. So they're in a pen and they're all receiving the diet. So we didn't have intakes for about 20 days post dry off. But what we did see when they came back to the close up area, which they went back into the tie stall facility along with the rumination information, was that the cows essentially just dealt with the situation during the dry period.
Isn't she so
They
resilient?
course
Let's just
corrected.
pause and be like, wow, this cow is great. And that's got to give us some solace here, guys. You work hard every single day and you try to
Yes,
do right to your herd. And just know that she's gonna smooth out all the bumps, right? If that silage
exactly.
harvest isn't going exactly how you had planned here in the middle of August, that's okay. Work with your nutritionist, try to do the best you can. But even if you really throw it off, like you guys really threw it off,
Oh, big time.
you really threw it off. And she says, I got this. It
It's
was so
it was
impressive.
crazy.
Hmm.
And you always hindsight is 2020 and like all science, it takes you like now I have 100 more questions.
I
Um
know, right?
but what we saw was that the high energy cows, what they did was they ate less than
Yes.
the low energy cows. The low energy cows ate more, and when they gave birth, they were all about the same.
They compensated for it. Yes. And
And
and graphically, guys, this is one of those papers that, sometimes you can do without clicking on the link, but this is definitely one that you maybe ought to click on the link and look at the visual differences because those high energy cows are graphed out with the red line and the low energy with the black line, and you can really see the data teased out. And what's interesting to me is that over the treatment period, we maybe didn't see significant differences, but it's noteworthy that those low energy cows early in lactation ate more in the first 3 weeks.
yes.
And and I think, in all of these transition cow trials that I read through obsessively, anytime you can get those cows to eat more during that window of time, it has to spell success.
Yes.
Almost always. And so I think that when I looked at that graph on figure 3D, I was like, wow, she got them to
Hmm.
eat, you know? And
And that was exactly it. I mean, it really, really supports like a lot of people's work in the space. Sabine Mann
mhm,
and Jess McCart and myself and others, Barry Bradford, that if
mhm,
you can get the cows to eat,
she's going to do it.
they can make up for a lot of these other issues. Yes, you should really fine tune your diets appropriately, but
Mhm.
getting them off to that good intake start when they calve is so important.
Yeah, I think the actual quantifiable difference when you convert it over to pounds is, guys, they were consuming about 4 pounds a day more
Yeah.
than your high energy cows. Now, let's talk a little bit about in your discussion. I know it wasn't measured specifically in this trial, but the visceral fat. Talk about how we do the best we can utilizing this free measurement of body condition score. And we're trying to even get better through the science by measuring back fat, knowing that guys in the
Mhm.
field's probably not going to do that. But let's talk about visceral fat and what that fat is doing as it's moving through this 6 week window.
Yeah, so of course, again, hindsight's 2020, but getting a liver biopsy would have told us where did the fat go?
Right.
Was it depositing it in the liver? And I mean, it doesn't appear that they have fatty liver based on biomarkers, but
Uh-huh.
where did it actually go?
Go.
And the other part, like I said, I mentioned that we saw these groups of cows that just were like, we don't care what you feed us, we'll just adjust by making milk
Hmm.
or not making milk.
Right.
And so I wonder if there's something there as well from a metabolic standpoint that could be
Hmm.
happening, within the tissue itself. And so we did
Yeah.
this part way into the project because we saw this happening. So we don't have lots and lots of samples and we still have to process them. But we took some mammary gland biopsies to see
Cool.
if we could get some data from that. But, we certainly did measure some interesting things. And as I said, I'm hoping to get that paper submitted here shortly.
That's exciting.
And it really came from my student, again, very frustratingly and very expensively, of course. It's not cheap to run these analyses,
Right,
but
exactly.
he'd come in and Tiago was like, Laura, nothing changed.
Nothing
I
changed.
read this, I
Yes.
tried this, nothing changed. What
Hmm.
next? Like this didn't change. What should we do
Sure.
next? And sometimes, a lot of times the best science comes that way because, the obvious thing doesn't work out. So what is it?
Yeah.
And that's what we learned a lot of from this study.
There's some gears moving in there somewhere. So, as the lactation gal, let's talk a little bit about Denovo fatty acids. And so, I guess it's starting at
Yes.
the 30,000 foot.
You.
Spoiler alert, guys. I think she said it several times. Nothing happened. In addition to nothing happening, so we didn't see a production difference. You didn't see so
Mm-mm.
both on volume or components. But you did see a slight shift in the fatty acid concentrations comparing the high energy versus the low energy. Let's talk a little bit about that oleic acid
Hmm.
in the milk harvested from those high energy cows.
Well, I mean, when you're feeding something like Megalac, you're going to shift what's being made in the gland naturally
Hmm.
versus what's not made in the gland and is coming from the diet. And this is certainly what I would say more Kevin Harvatine and Adam Locke's area.
Hmm.
But I was not surprised to see that because they're getting that extra source that isn't going to stimulate in that balance where it's about 50-50 on what's coming from the diet and what's being made in the mammary gland. But if you feed more long chain fatty acids over the 16 carbon, you're going to have more long chain fatty acids in the mammary gland and less de
Boom.
novo, and vice versa.
Yes.
So that was not super surprising to me. It also made me feel better that the diet was getting in there and they were
It was
using it
definitely, yeah, definitely
appropriately.
happening. So, just for clarity, the diet that was fed between these two groups in early lactation, that subsequent lactation, wasn't different,
No,
right?
no,
So, this was a carryover effect from
yes.
the previous lactation's ration through the dry period, that mammary gland.
Hmm.
Or so would that be stored in the liver, maybe? Like what, how,
Potentially.
because
Um,
we're talking 50 days
yeah,
later
yep,
I guess because it was the first 3 weeks and so it
yes,
was as many as 100 days later you're still seeing
yes,
a response of
yes.
this fatty acid carrying forward. That's really interesting.
Yes. So, and I, and I don't know if that's because of the amount we were doing. I mean, clearly no one wants to feed that much like we did. It was a super physiological attempt.
Yes.
But it was very interesting to see that it carried over that long. And even though you dry the animal off at 40 to 50 days, depending on where you're at, that mammary gland is in the last phases of colostrum formation and
Hmm.
activation of lactogenesis, getting close to that. And so it's
That's so fascinating.
like this priming of the lactocytes and how you trigger them metabolically to interact with the liver and what's coming from the liver and how that's stored is an area that is there's a lot to be seen there and to be sorted out. So again, makes me wish we'd taken a bunch of mammary biopsies and a bunch of liver biopsies and
Yeah.
left us with a lot more questions because it was impressive how it primed that. Although there is literature that suggests that the mammary gland can have what's called like lactocrine programming. So this
Mm-hmm.
effective diet, not just choline or methionine, there are all these different things that can shift what these cells are doing. And during that last period of time of pregnancy, they're really being proliferated
Ramped up.
heavily
Yeah.
and getting ready to make milk. So this
Right.
impact on enzymatic pathways, preferentially dealing with something due to a diet, it isn't totally surprising, but it is like
Mm-hmm.
very, very understudied.
Yeah. Well, and we keep talking about Megalac and the concentration of the ration. So
Mhm.
summarized there on table one early in the paper, the calcium salts of fatty acids had 2.6% of the ration for the high energy and then zero in all the other rations. So
Mhm.
none in the low energy, none in the dry off, none in the close up, and none in the next lactations
Mhm.
milk ration. So yeah, that's really impressive that it carried forward. And I thought kind of a fun detail
Mhm.
of the paper.
It was definitely sad that we didn't get any, like I said, liver biopsies would have been revealing, but where we started from was what happens with BCS and what is the
Sure.
mechanism to these like
Right.
health disorders, and we ended up in a very different place. So,
Well, and you've got to start the question somewhere, right?
mhm.
And so that's really interesting. And if it serves you any solace, every single author that I talk to every single month always says, "But wait, there's more." And it's almost become a
Always.
point of yeah, it's kind of a joke at this point because every single author has said that. Okay, I think perhaps something important to note is that the 66 head that were enrolled in your research project, they were on average about 240 days at that moment, right, when you
Mhm.
were differentiating them. So these aren't girls that had trouble breeding back. They
No.
weren't long days in milk and were going to bulk up. These are just going to be really average, well-managed Holsteins, right?
Yes, that's correct. The average in lactation number was 2.9 for the high energy and 2.7 for the low, and there was no differences.
Yeah, and so I think it's important for listeners to realize that if you're having trouble breeding back your cows, let's not tinker with the ration and throw a bunch of high energy over to them and expect them to perform the way these animals did in this particular well-managed herd.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so my favorite question to ask every author is, what would you like boots on the ground dairymen to learn from this informative project?
I guess the biggest thing that I took home from it is that you have to invest in your dry cows.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of things that people do in late lactation, for economic reasons and health reasons, but you really need to invest in your dry cow diet and making sure that they're getting well managed diets, and that if you're doing that, they really should transition well unless there's some massive, problem that could pop up, whether it's like they were at days in lactation, as you mentioned, or they're very, very old, or, something of that magnitude. But what it really told us is if you take care of your dry cows and you get them eating afterwards, you can really deal with a lot of the issues that come out. So
Fantastic.
everyone does it in a different way based on their farm and their environment and their labor force, but that is where you should put your money.
Can't ignore it. Did you hear that, guys? That is where you should put your money. Seriously, there's so much research that supports that, and this does too. Well, Dr. Hernandez, I thank you so much for your time and willingness to share your science with the audience and to help folks understand how these changes in their ration it could have sizable impact And listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day today to learn about energy partitioning that occurs through that late lactation and then subsequent lactation, early lactation phase, because that information helps illuminate the black box of the transition cow that we're trying to learn so much about. I've learned a lot from our conversation, and this has been the August edition of the Dairy Science Digest, a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles and press because it's sound science to base your management decisions around and provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluell with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.